Well, to moderate this debate, we needed one of the best, brightest Bitcoin podcasting minds in Bitcoin, and that is, of course, our man, Stefan Livera. The debate is going to take a very similar style to yesterday's debate. However, we have 2-on-2 this time, and from the backstage discussions, I think this is going to get fiery. So, no more rambling on from me. Please welcome your MC, your moderator for the day, Stefan Livera, to the stage for the first Bitcoin debate of today. Go on, Stefan.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so the use of the Bitcoin Blockspace. I'm excited for this debate. We're going to have 2-on-2, and there might even be disagreement internal to the team. So let's see what happens. So firstly, I'm going to introduce our debaters today. So on one side, we've got Dashjr. He's the CTO and chairman of Ocean, and previously created Rizzo, and also is a Bitcoin core contributor. So everyone, please welcome Luke to the stage. Next up, joining him on his team is Bitcoin Mechanic. He's the chief boiling officer of Ocean, and also very well known for his commentary. So welcome, Bitcoin Mechanic. Now, opposing these gentlemen is our other team. We have Pete Rizzo from Bitcoin Magazine and a Bitcoin historian. Welcome, Pete Rizzo. Joining Pete Rizzo is an actor known for playing Satoshi on HBO. It's Peter Todd, everybody. He's known for giving talks about Bitcoin. All right, so I'll just jump down now. And so because we've got 2-on-2 for this one, it's going to be a slightly different structure. I'll just explain the rough structure and then we'll get into it. We're going to have each person will get 5 minutes. Obviously, we'll start with one side and go back and forth. And then we're going to have a bit of a, moderated back and forth, and we're going to see some real fighting. And then everybody at the end will get 1 minute of closing speech time. All right, so on this side, I think Bitcoin Mechanic, you're going to be starting. So your 5 minutes starts now.
Is this working? All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. Hello, everyone. So I've been arguing about arbitrary data storage and tolerance therein for the last year. And against my better judgment, I'll make an argument I haven't made that entire time. And cheesy, but I'm going to do audience participation. How many people were around for SegWit being activated? All right, how many of you were excited about SegWit getting activated? Keep your hands up, right? Let's just keep it up, and I'll keep listening until you want to put it down. How many of you were excited about SegWit getting activated because it fixed transaction malleability and allowed us to have bidirectional payment channels, aka Lightning? Was that the motivation? All right, how many people were excited about activating SegWit so that we could store JPEGs in Bitcoin's blockchain? Right. Therein lies the problem. It was never a part of the discussion. And unfortunately, it's become an unintentional byproduct of a decision made for other reasons, which is fine, and of course happens in software all the time. But the issue we now face is the fact that if we cannot get past the fact that Bitcoin is being used in a way that was not the intention of the people working on it or its users, and we're slowly bleeding into other territory that throws into question all of the game theory and all of the assumptions we've made about how reliable this thing is going to be. We're trying to build perfect money here. We're not trying to build a generic file storage system. And the extent to which Bitcoin can be used for generic file storage is the extent to which it fails as a purely monetary network. And unfortunately, tools that are good for one thing tend not to be all-purpose tools that are good for everything. Bitcoin is not a Swiss Army knife. It has a very specific function, and the extent to which it could be used for other things is, as I said, the extent to which it kind of sucks for the purpose for which it's designed. And there are ramifications for this, unfortunately, because we watched a great debate here yesterday with Paolo and Giacomo, and we talked about covenants and UTXO sharing and things we might do to make Lightning a lot less interactive. These are upgrades that really, really would be helpful for Bitcoin to have, but people, frankly, are in a situation where we're looking at upgrades that have happened and we're saying unintended consequences are now labeled as controversial No one can predict unknown unknowns. Who knows what happens with CTV, who knows what happens with CSFS, or any other covenant upgrade we might do. As much as I might like what they do on paper, and as convinced as their advocates might be of the fact that there will be no unintended consequences, the fact remains that those are possible, and the exploiters of those unintended consequences, who to add insult to injury are just scammers, to add insult to injury, they are going to come along and make everything controversial when it comes to fixing it. And as a result, those fixes are just not going to happen, and Bitcoin is going to slowly lose the essence of what it is and bleed out into becoming just, sorry, pardon my language, but just generic shitcoinery. Like, the boundary between what Bitcoin is and what crypto is has been massively just muddied and ruined, and it invites, I'm not going to get into other topics exactly, but it's creating a lot of
narrative
smudging
confusion
that we do not want to see.
All right,
I'll round off there. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, all right, if that's okay. Well, Pete Rizzo, you're up.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo. First off, grateful to be here. A lot of respect for everybody on the stage and learned a lot. So pleased to now continue arguing. And secondly, I'll say that I didn't really run my argument by Peter Todd. So if he drifts to the middle of the stage and opposes my argument, you'll know why. So my focus is really on the sociology and history of Bitcoin, right? So most of the opposing arguments around arbitrary data storage, they focus on the idea that Bitcoin is money, and it would be better if Bitcoin was, quote, just money, right? We just heard that argument evoked. To which my response is that Bitcoin has very clearly always been other things than money, and it's still money, and not only that, it's the best money that we've ever had. So removing arbitrary data from Bitcoin would appear ahistorical. It's an argument that Bitcoin should be different than it always has been for reasons that aren't clear. So there's arbitrary data on Bitcoin, and there has been always, all the way back to the Genesis block. There's the Times of London newspaper article in there. There are a sicky art depicting Len Sassaman, and that still impacts our cultural conversation today. We've seen Mastercoin counterparty and embedded consensus protocols take advantage of this, all the way up to ordinals, BRC20s, and runes today, to inventions like Peter Todd's open timestamps, which are validating presidential elections in the developing world. So I start with the premise, while it's obviously good if the blockchain is smaller, and it's obviously good if we're agreeing to things in consensus, there has always been arbitrary data on Bitcoin. You can debate the placement of this data, whether it's in the Coinbase or the Opportun or in a transaction, but the reality is the system has always accommodated this because these transactions pay fees. The core developers, in closing the bug reports filed for ordinals, gave the following summation. Bitcoin Core is not supposed to be political. It's not supposed to decide the validity of fee-paying transactions. The default assumption is that fees on Bitcoin will be and are paid by many types of applications, and that the only prevention is economics and spam, right? This is the invention of Adam Back. Hashcash was designed to prevent spam, right? So fees prevent spam. So when people ask me why I'm interested in ordinals, the answer that I give is I'm interested in Bitcoin, and I'm interested in Bitcoin as a money and settlement system for the future, for as long as possible in that future. And today there are only two real hypotheses for what that future will look like. One, blocks are full of fee-paying transactions, and those fees replace the block subsidy, will eventually go to zero, ensuring that Bitcoin is thermodynamically secure. In this view, all of the problems created by arbitrary data and protocols such as ordinals are directionally problems you would want to have if you want to build the kind of structures that will need to continue using Bitcoin in a future of high fees. I allow that fees can continue to be low and that people might run nodes and mine transactions altruistically, but we simply don't know. So I invite you to consider that in this case, one of these two hypotheses about how Bitcoin will operate in perpetuity is falsifiable. We can test that today, and I'm interested in that test. Further, arbitrary data transactions obviously open up new pathways to adoption. Some people are choosing to be opportunistic about this and attracting users who are chasing beta on Bitcoin. But whether this involves people who are buying master stock or meme coins seems really immaterial. Yes, people might be doing immoral activity, speculation, and spam, and you might genuinely think that meme coins, stable coins, NFTs are all going to zero, but that market is still 10 years old and, based on data, roughly the same size as Bitcoin. So someone at this conference told me that Casey Rodarmar should, quote, rot in hell for creating the Ordinals protocol. And they also said that they would remove open timestamps from Bitcoin. And so I asked people to consider that if your argument is on the grounds of morality, and that is the rights of node operators, we should also consider the rights of protocol software issuers.
Okay, well, thank you, Pete Rizzo. Luke, would you like to take your 5 minutes now?
I think the historical claims that you've made are not accurate at all. There needs to be some more specific layer. You cited things like the Genesis block, which, yes, every block has 95 bytes for miners to put some data, but that's nothing compared to actual spam that we're trying to discuss here, I guess. And also things like counterparty master coin runes, to an extent, even the BRC20 stuff is not the same as arbitrary data. Arbitrary data would be things like inscriptions and JPEGs on the chain. The other stuff is just issued assets tokens, and those are mostly bad for different reasons from arbitrary data, and not the same thing at all. So to say that there's been arbitrary data through Bitcoin's history is not accurate. And even when these issued assets, much less arbitrary data, have been introduced in the past, it was several years into Bitcoin and was seen as harmful and resisted at the time and resisted throughout all of Bitcoin's history. As far as spam goes, outright arbitrary data, Satoshi added the very first spam filters back in 2010, and this has been something that's always been considered an abuse of the system and always been filtered throughout Bitcoin's history.
Well, you're still here. Are you still on my side?
Okay. Luke, you've still got a few more minutes, or are you done with your time? Okay, if that's fine. Okay, so let's go now to Peter. Todd, take your 5 minutes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Pete had a good point. Maybe I'll just move a
Okay,
little more
well, there
over
you go.
here.
Yeah.
But you know, it's kind of funny hearing people go talk about spam in reference to things like inscriptions, data on the chain, and whatnot. But you know, we've already had this discussion before with purely monetary use case spam. It was called Satoshi Roulette, and people got very annoyed that like 95% of all Bitcoin transactions were sending money back and forth to this gambling site called Satoshi Roulette. And a lot of people, I remember, were very...
Satoshi Dice?
Or Satoshi Dice, yes, Satoshi
yeah,
Dice.
And there was also Just Dice and other stuff, yeah.
There were a bunch of copycats, yeah, but yeah, I think you're correct, Satoshi Dice.
Yeah.
And you know, the way Satoshi Dice works is you sent money to a particular Bitcoin address, and it would do some calculation based on the hash and whether or not you won, and you get your money back. Or maybe you wouldn't get your money back. And with like 95% of Bitcoin transactions at the peak being Satoshi Dice, people said, well, you know, this is spam, this is an abuse of the system. And all right, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But like the bigger issue is, can you stop this? Now, I happen to be wearing a lovely t-shirt here by the RGB protocol, which is a protocol that uses Bitcoin for anti-double spend prevention to allow you to go and trade things on Bitcoin. You know, you could use RGB to go and represent an NFT of a house, or, you know, USDT, or anything you wanted. But the nature of RGB is that you can't censor it. RGB transactions look like just any other transactions. I mean, ordinals is even a more extreme example of this. Every single Bitcoin transaction is an ordinal transaction. They are indistinguishable. Ordinal inscription, sure, yeah, the inscription part, but like you're just not going to be successful in it. And trying to stop this stuff creates problems. I mean, we've already seen this actually with full RBF, where compact block filters stopped working because people were trying to prevent full RBF double spends. The idea just didn't work because miners wanted the money. Miners turned full RBF on, and by the time you had like 100% of miners mining full RBF and a decent amount of full RBF replacements, compact block filters stopped working. You know, I have my fork of Bitcoin Core called Libera Relay, which turns off one of the very few filters that Bitcoin Core actually has. And I got to point out, Bitcoin Core does not actually have much in the way of filtering. There are certain things, certain transaction types that filters out for very clear technical reasons around soft forks, but other than the historical example of op return, basically nothing is filtered out. Any valid transaction, for the most part, is allowed. And that's just how Bitcoin Core works. And the one example of op return, well, Libera Relay turns it off because, well, I can. And it does preferential peering so that if you run Libera Relay nodes, they'll all connect to each other and get the transactions around. And what's the long story short of that? If you go to opreturnbot.com and put in 81 bytes of text, even though that's a non-standard transaction according to Bitcoin Core and according to Luke Jr.'s Notch implementation, it will get mined. That's just the reality of it. Trying to go stop this stuff doesn't really work. Now, Does this mean like maybe we shouldn't be cautious with things like opcat, which might invite use cases that we don't want? Yeah, sure, I'm willing to say that. But for the things that we're discussing here, things like inscriptions, things like ordinal transactions, things like my own open timestamps, the cat's out of the bag. You can't stop them. Open timestamps is designed to be censorship resistant. Nobody's ever going to block open timestamps on Bitcoin unless Bitcoin turns out into a pure central bank digital currency where KYC is required to send a transaction. And we're not going to do that, so you're not going to block it.
You're arguing a straw man, though. There's no goal of censorship. Everybody uses spam filters for their email. Does it mean that you never see spam? No, the spam will always get through the spam filters eventually. But it makes email usable.
Spam filters are censorship from the point of view of spammers.
No, they can publish their spam anywhere they want. That actually does publication in the first place. Bitcoin does not provide that service.
Doesn't matter whether or not you say it provides it. The fact is, from a technical point of view, the service exists.
Well,
That's how it is.
Here's the issue with using censorship in such a reckless manner is Bitcoin's biggest, one of the biggest concerns we have in Bitcoin right now is censorship, because 50% of block templates are made by 2 actors. And censorship, used in the correct context, is a government coming to a mining pool and saying you need to exclude all these transactions from these entities. It's not, it doesn't happen in an effort to restrict Bitcoin to a certain use case. It aims to restrict one use case to a certain group of people, and that is with a connotation with censorship as a concept. So respectfully as possible, I will advise you to stop using censorship to describe spam filtration, because it's a politically loaded term, and it's also the boy who cried wolf, because Bitcoin does not have censorship right now, and I'd wager that every single person in this room is sitting there with data carrier size set to 83 on their Bitcoin node, and to be told you're censoring by doing that is ridiculous, and you should reject anyone telling you that you are.
Look, censorship is a term.
Well, I mean, basically we're into the back and forth now anyway, so we might as well have that back and forth, so go on.
I mean, in fact, so it's actually widely talked about in decentralized messaging apps that censorship is essential for decentralized messaging, because you need to go censor out bad actors from your communities to go and make it work.
Agreed.
But the reality is, what you're talking about with filtering, censoring, whatever you want to call it, preventing certain types of Bitcoin transaction from getting mined, you just can't do it. I mean, it's like you have a mining pool. You have Elijah's. Is Elijah's doing anything to prevent me from getting in an 81 byte op return? No, it just doesn't work. No amount of people running Bitcoin Knots nodes is going to change the fact that Libra Relay nodes completely bypass them.
I mean, we didn't even have to do anything like that extreme. In the past, things like Counterparty, we could get rid of these things with forum posts. It's just saying, look, pardon my language, fuck off back to Ethereum. And that's enough to make developers go, Bitcoin's hostile to us, screw it, we're going to go somewhere else.
Counterparty never went away. I mean, Mastercoin, of all things, continued to be used behind Tether for years and years and years, no matter how much Bitcoin people said they didn't like it. What got rid of it was economic incentives.
Before we get too far, I just want to point out that spam is not Bitcoin transactions. It's other data that's been obfuscated and cut into pieces and reorganized to make it look like it's a Bitcoin transaction. But the purpose of the data is not to actually send Bitcoins from one person to another. There's a fundamental difference there.
It doesn't matter what you claim the fundamental difference is there. It's a technically valid Bitcoin transaction.
No, it does matter, because...
So was the guy that printed 150 billion Bitcoins during the inflation bug. Well, technical validity says nothing about the intentions of the people using the tech.
We decided to change the Bitcoin protocol, because the Bitcoin protocol that let you create Bitcoins out of thin air was a bad idea. Unfortunately, we cannot change the consensus protocol to prevent people from making inscriptions.
And it's not required either. You don't nuke an ant. You don't nuke a mosquito. You don't fight spam with consensus. All you need to do when it comes to arbitrary data countering is you approach it with the manner in which it comes. It's not a game of whack-a-mole where you can realistically fight it with consensus.
Why do you think that the Bitcoin core developers don't support your position? Like, what is your opinion on that? Because they've been very clear, and if they're not going to do anything about the issue, and if it's going to continue, then we're in a reality where these transactions are going to continue in their current form. So what is the purpose of continuing the conversation?
Well, for a start, they haven't. the controversy around spam was in an environment where you had ordinals, inscriptions, stamps, BRC20.
Well, that's still the present reality.
No, it's not. All you see
100%.
at the moment is just a bunch of runes, which is just op return, which was the
Well,
olive branch
but
we
in that-
offered,
in that
saying,
case,
wait
it's
a
like
minute,
what-
wait a minute, saying, if you're going to include arbitrary data in the chain, can you at least do it in a way that doesn't bloat the UTXO set, doesn't undermine Bitcoin's fungibility, doesn't abuse the witness discount, and that is what that spam does. In reality,
I mean,
we're in a much better
just the other
position
day,
now.
I was looking at mempool.space with her actually quite useful new labels and noticed an inscription transaction in the latest mempool, and it got mined a few minutes later. I mean, the simple reality is none of this stuff has been stopped. Now, certainly fads come and go, and I'll be the first to say inscriptions, ordinals, all this stuff is very faddish.
Sure.
BRC20 is probably diminished because a lot of the hype around it was just scammy, faddish crap. But
I mean, it's
it
a
didn't
scam.
go away because we did anything. It went away because taking millions of dollars from people in exchange for nothing is self-limiting.
But again, stopping it is not necessary. You don't have to stop all email spam to mitigate your email and make it usable. The Ocean is 0.5% of the network, and still it's already making Bitcoin more usable for people that actually want to use Bitcoin.
Only by tossing away money. I mean, I will say the one thing Ocean does that
we do a lot of things.
Hang on.
We do a
I want
lot.
to agree with you
I'll
for a
give
second.
you a list.
I want to agree with you a second. The one thing Ocean does that arguably makes Bitcoin more usable is it does mean that at least some miners are leaving money on the table. So occasionally transactions get mined at much
Miners
lower
are not
fee.
leaving money on the
Hang
table.
hang on a
Miners
second.
make
Hang on,
10 to 15%
I'm trying to
more
agree
on
with you
Ocean.
here. Let me say. So transactions do get mined at lower fee rates than they otherwise would have because of Ocean. Because of these filters, spam, whatever you want to call it, because it is not including these other transactions, effectively the fee rates for transactions is lower on Ocean. And people do get things mined that they otherwise wouldn't
The
have.
point that I'm asking is we can debate all the semantics of all these use cases, we can debate their validity, but what do you want to achieve? Like what is the status quo that you want? Because it would seem like the current environment where all this stuff has been economically excluded and it has become unpopular now, like what is it that you want to achieve?
Well, yeah, I would like to continue as we have been, right? Which is you can have an op return, you can either have it as big as you like with block size limit, or I think it's 10,000 bytes, right? You're limited to. And you never saw op returns bigger than 83 bytes because they were non-standard and it's inefficient to deal with. I mean, okay, I'm sure there's exceptions, but generally people stayed within the confines of the mempool filters that were the default policy. So again, this is ultimately, to be fair, you haven't done it particularly egregiously, but it's the nirvana fallacy. You cannot ever tackle spam. It's just a perennial struggle. If you don't do it, the system becomes unusable. If you try and do it too heavily, yes, then you're going to have too many false positives, but it's just one of those things you just have to do, and it's something that we've always demonstrably done. And if you take an ideological position and say, well, that shouldn't, I'm kind of unclear on whether you're saying it's not possible to do it or we shouldn't do it, because they are very different positions.
We shouldn't do it because trying to do it causes more problems than it solves. So this is why the Bitcoin Core developers have said, you know what, we threw up our hands. We tried before to filter out transaction we didn't like. We're giving up on that because it demonstrably does not work. This is why Taproot did not add filters. This is why SegWit did not add filters. This is why when you go all the way back to P2SH, we deliberately removed a bunch of restrictions on what kind of scripts you could use.
Except it has always worked.
Knowing full well that people would use it to put things in the chain. I mean, I have a tool called publishText.py. It's an example of my Python Bitcoin libs library.
Also, like we've referred to Bitcoin if you want to invoke the block size wars, the whole referendum there was that Bitcoin was a settlement layer, right? This is the specific verbiage. Bitcoin would become a settlement layer. Settlement of what? Well, settlement of things, of use cases, applications.
Luke, you had a response before?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that it has always worked. It has successfully worked. It's only this past year or two that certain developers have just decided they're going to neglect the problem, and that's why it's become more and more of a problem in these past 2 years, because people have not made the effort that they have in the past to fight the attacks.
Again, this is a very simple thing. If you want to go mine an op return more than 80 bytes, in fact, any of you can do this. Just go to, I think it's opreturnbot.com, type in your text, make sure it's more than 80 bytes, pay the fee, and within about an hour, a miner will have picked it up, and you're done. And that uses my Libra relay under the hood, which is just a set of nodes who've decided to remove the upper trend limits.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter what anyone else does, because this gets down to the nature of information and censorship. In fact, I think this quote from Satoshi is basically that Bitcoin works because information is easy to spread and hard to stifle. An unconfirmed transaction is information. If you don't like that unconfirmed transaction and try to prevent it from spreading by putting filters in your Bitcoin implementation, people who don't care, like myself, will let that information spread, and we'll get to miners who are willing to accept the fee to put it in a block. Unless you want to start changing
my bigger problem, though, is like, what is this a conversation?
Sorry, can we get the response from the other side to Peter's point there?
Bitcoin only works if we manage to successfully fight off the spam. If malicious actors are left unchecked to just continue bloating the chain and attacking the network, Bitcoin will not work. It will fail.
Well,
the only way anyone
your argument is Bitcoin will fail.
The only way Bitcoin can survive attacks is if the attacks are actually fought. If you just let people attack the network and destroy it, there won't be anything left.
They don't have the consciousness that they even are attacking the network. In most cases, these people are so uneducated doing things that they don't understand. And so look, you guys have a basic us versus them mentality where and I think this is the core part of like the issue with a lot of your arguments, is that it relies on there being bad people. There are bad people doing bad things, but who are the bad people and what are the bad things they're doing? In the case of ordinals and some of these things, they're sending Bitcoin transactions, they're paying fees to miners, they're supporting the network where they otherwise would be using Ethereum or Solana or any of these other things. So if they're really attacking the network, like, what's the attack? The attack is that they're using Bitcoin.
Then maybe we need to be clear that if you go to Peter Todd's website and spam the network like this, you are attacking Bitcoin. So I would highly recommend not doing that.
Okay.
And I got a point. This is actually kind of where maybe I'll stand a little more over here.
Ooh.
But like, when you get down to it, it really doesn't matter what you go say about the morality of this stuff. It is technically possible to do. The reason why we have the block size limit is in big part because you need, in consensus, some way to go stop spam. You do need a way to stop spam in consensus. But because we can't have a consensus that tries to understand what every transaction does, we just do the simple thing of having a limit on size. And you just go pay your fees to go get in. The fact is, we just do not have the ability to pick and choose what things people use Bitcoin for, provided that they're valid transactions.
You do to some extent, demonstrably.
Well.
Like, look, I mean, you walk into someone's garage, for argument by analogy, come at me, but you walk into someone's garage, there's a bit of wood that's got like a hole in it, the shape of the head of a nail, because they've used it to bash a nail in because they didn't have a hammer. If you look at the design of Bitcoin, you see just footprints everywhere of attempts being made to try and restrict people to using it for actual financial activity. It's everywhere. It's why there's a witness discount to try and shrink the UTXO set. This was an incredibly important and well-motivated thing. That's why you have the witness discount. So when someone comes along and abuses the fact that that's there to store pages, you can go on Mempoolspace, load up, click on show more for one of these transactions and your browser tab will
No. You can do much better. Go to bitcoinstrings.com and go scroll through the all list. And years ago, long before you claimed this was not an issue, there is literally pages and pages of IRC logs because someone decided to upload all of the IRC logs using my published text tool with P2SH. And like that's just how the Bitcoin protocol works. You can go put whatever you want in there, and that's just that.
No, you can't.
Yes, you can.
As Giacomo pointed out to you in a beautiful exchange you and him had, if that is going to be your rubric for censorship definition, then Bitcoin is the biggest censorship engine that's ever existed on the planet because it so strictly restricts people into a certain type of behavior.
But it doesn't. I mean, like you keep on making these claims that Bitcoin does this, Bitcoin does that. But the technical reality is all of your efforts at filtering, censoring, whatever you want to call it, they have failed.
No,
the only
they've
thing that's
succeeded.
successful is things at the consensus level.
Every time they have actually been done, every time filters have been used, they have succeeded. Even with 0.5% of the network using filters, it still has a significant impact.
No, it's perfectly true. I'll explain. Look, here, this is not just pointless Karening, right? The Taproot wizards came out and called us blockchain Karens, right? And they tried to meme this whole thing that didn't really work, I'm glad to say. But look, the reality of it is, back in 2022, all I did was sync low-end Bitcoin hardware, and this was one of the motivations for the block size war. We needed to to be trivial to run a node. Now, fast forward to a year of spam and UTXO bloat, you cannot use a Raspberry Pi 5 with an SSD anymore because it just cannot get through 100 million UTXOs that got added to the set. Before 2023, we were at 80 million UTXOs.
I mean, I've done this recently. You can, in fact, use a Raspberry Pi 5. Like, what you're saying is just not technically correct.
Well, you're using an NVMe, though.
No, with a micro SD card. You just wait a while.
Look, the benchmarks
Look,
are
I've
there.
done this. Like, it's slow to sync, but it does work. It just chews through it eventually, and it ends up syncing.
Look,
I mean, like, I'm sorry, you just keep on saying things that are just not technically correct.
It's correct. It's totally correct. I have the benchmarks posted up there. I filmed the thing. If you want to claim that I'm bullshitting, you can. But I rigged it. I rigged it so that it would only connect to one node over my LAN. I assumed valid. I did just about everything you could do to
I have one of them
an
sitting in my
IBD.
apartment, like, that's synced up. I mean, yes, it takes a while because the UTXO set's bigger, but like none of this stuff is relevant. The fact is everything you've tried to do to stop this has failed.
So why would you have a witness discount to try and motivate the shrinking of the UTXO set if you can bloat it without any
witness
consequence?
Discount is a consensus rule. You guys are not talking about consensus rules. If you can find a consensus rule that goes and prevents a certain type of transaction, you can successfully prevent it. I'm not going to argue otherwise on that. That's certainly true. You know, we do have, and of course the biggest example of consensus rule that prevents spam is the block size. Like, that's what creates a fee market. Some chains do not have a block size, and they have had massive issues with spam of people just trying to make the chain bigger and bigger until everything fails. You know, BSV being one of the most hilarious examples of this. But trying to do things with filters, trying to prevent data from propagating around the peer-to-peer network, that just demonstrably doesn't work. Trying to go and have miners not mine things demonstrably doesn't work because other miners mine it.
It worked for the first decade of Bitcoin. It works to the 0.5%
well, it didn't work for the first decade of Bitcoin. Yes, it did. I'm sorry, it just didn't. Like my publish text tool is proof positive that it did not work. Anyone who wanted to publish text to the chain could, and people did.
Are you under the illusion that NOTS is 0 data carrier size, not 42?
Look, published text has nothing to do with the data carrier size. It
the
just
fact
takes
that some spam gets through does not change the fact that spam filters reduce spam and make Bitcoin usable.
Let me try to ask a question this way to Luke and to Mechanic. How far should people go to try and stop the spam? Like, should there be, you know, would you go to the extreme of trying to lock down opcodes or whitelist things, or, you know, can you give us a sense of how far you think the community or the node runners should go? If you see spam as a problem, how far should we go?
In 2010, when Satoshi introduced the first spam filters, it was a whitelist. You could only do specific transactions that were well defined. I think that should be on the table. It clearly has the precedent. I don't think we need to go that far. It would be unfortunate if we did have to go that far.
Yeah. Now, the other point I think this has been debated by you also, but I think there is some dispute about what reduced, let's say, the level of the spam, right? I think on one side of the debate, it's like, oh, they got economically priced out over time, or just it was too costly. And I guess your side would be sort of more like, no, the existence of, you know, the anti-spam movement, let's say. How would you?
That's it, right? There's always going to be arbitrary data getting into the chain to some capacity, but that's very different from something that can go and spend months raising funds to monetize and gamify a spam attack that requires millions of dollars and millions of, you know, cajoling venture capitalists into, no, come to Bitcoin. This is where we're going to do NFTs now. Like, we know it's got a very limited life cycle. We know that to get enough, you know, idiots with NFT avatars on Twitter to like actually buy into it and make the whole thing self-sustaining, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of capital. And the VCs are pretty hesitant to do that if the community they're trying to do this to is hostile to it. And that was actually that's why I say it was forum posts that made these people go, well, screw it. I'll go over to Solana or Ethereum where they actually want me to do this stuff. They're not going to present any issue to us. So this is why I'm like, spam is always a practical fight. It's never an ideological fight because you can never really strictly define it. But in this sense, it's trivial for you to say, look, we don't want you to come and build some horrible scheme on top of
I would
the whole
argue
thing.
that our attempts to stop it only motivated them further. And in absence of attempts to stop that, they only became more motivated.
It's a double-edged sword, I will grant you that. To some extent, you're just giving them free marketing by getting outraged
the marketing for inscriptions was mainly you guys going and arguing it was a bad idea.
I will grant you that it's
Had you guys
both.
ignored inscriptions, they probably would have gone nowhere. In much the same way is that no one made a big deal about my published text tool. So other than probably a couple people putting, I don't know, 10 megabytes worth of stuff in, for most part, kind of just died out and there weren't that many fees associated with it. But had a bunch of you guys said how terrible it was and got in press, I am sure a lot more people would have used it.
I think the difference
glad
is there's
you're
also
sure
a
of
collapse
that,
in
but
confidence on the other chains, right? Like Ethereum right now is just in technical disarray. Like a lot of those projects and people who raised money, like need somewhere to go. Those things are failing.
A lot of the inscription people are BSVers. I mean, I've met them, and they said, well, you know,
That's
BSV
true.
failed, and now we get to do all this fun stuff on Bitcoin.
Yeah, so imagine us defending ourselves from a bunch of Craig Wright fanboys trying to kill the fucking chain. Imagine us standing up to that and saying, this isn't what Bitcoin's for.
And we're defending ourselves with the self-defense equivalent of a super soaker.
A lot of
Okay,
these.
so let me try and ask this question, and this is an open discussion. You guys can go back and forth on this.
Can I point out, though, that a lot of these scam coins that have done this before, they failed because of the spam. Do we want Bitcoin to fail in the same way?
We don't, so we have the block size limit, and that's the best we can do.
The block size
let me
limit,
ask
there
this
is no-
question. I just want to ask this question, and have you guys can go back and forth on this. Let's talk about, if you see it as an issue, is it the severity of this issue? Is it a low issue or a high severity issue? Can we talk a bit about that? What do you guys think?
Can I just point out that there is no block size limit? There is currently a block weight limit, and the spam is able to make larger blocks than real transactions would ever make. So
that is a pedantic technical detail.
No, it's
it is not.
extremely important because one category of transaction that you say, hey, Bitcoin's neutral, everything's just a transaction. Actually, the spam is paying a quarter of the price for witness data, so that's not a fair market. You're giving a disproportionate advantage to people that want to use it for that.
That's a separate
not
argument.
neutral.
With
The difference
actual
between 1 and
transactions-
4 in a context like this really doesn't matter. That's a very pedantic argument to an audience like this who really doesn't care about minor
With actual
details like that.
transactions, Bitcoin blocks approach and are around 2 megabytes at most. With the spam, they can get much closer to the 4 megabyte theoretical limit.
Yeah. Now, I guess a challenge for Peter Todd and Peter Rizzo, does a more quote-unquote permissive approach to Bitcoin's blockchain use, does that degrade Bitcoin's quality as a money? Does it make it worse as a money?
I mean, the way I would say it is what matters is having consensus rules that let Bitcoin go operate. And we have the block size limit, and we have a fee market. And that is the best we can go do. We can improve on this for certain use cases with things like covenants, which let us get more transactions per second with the same amount or less block space. Certainly, fancy L2 systems that share one UTX over many people mean that a lot of this stuff really matters less. And from a user's perspective who just wants to make a Lightning transaction, what really matters is our fee rates high enough that can do the few on-chain transactions.
The question I would ask is, other than elevated fees, who's actually experienced a disruption in using the network? Even when blocks were full and they were spamming the blocks with full 4 megabyte transactions, I was able to send a transaction with a slightly higher fee and get it priority in the mempool. I mean, it's just, who's been disrupted? Who's being hurt from these things?
I think there's an almost absurd contradiction in your position, Peter. So your argument is that the primary spam filtration or anti-spam mechanism Bitcoin has is the block size limit or the block weight limit. But you're saying it's pedantry, the fact that you can store arbitrary data at 1/4 the price of people trying to do financial activity.
Yes, the difference between 1 and 1/4 in the context of a discussion like this really doesn't matter. I mean, fee rates to get into the next block have changed in the past day by more than a factor of 4. So, in a discussion like this, that bit of pedantry really doesn't matter. I mean, I could ask for a show of hands how many people understand what's the difference between block size and block weight. And I'd probably get at most half the people. All right.
Just ignore that he's insulting your intelligence for a minute.
Matter.
I hope you've all picked up on the point that giving spammers a 75% discount and saying that the limit on size is the primary mechanism is that's a completely contradictory position. It doesn't make any sense.
Who cares? Are you arguing for consensus change
I care
to get rid of
it's
the witness
a complete
space?
contradiction.
Again, are you arguing for consensus change to get rid of the witness discount?
No.
Well, so the discussion is moot. I mean, it's an interesting bit of pedantry for people who care about the nuance of exactly how Bitcoin works. But it's not relevant to this audience.
Can I ask her something? All right, can we be honest for a second?
I think
How
it's
many people
relevant to you
here?
guys.
How many people here own other cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin? Can we get a show of hands? Okay, how many people here? Please be honest. Like, we're trying to have an honest debate here. How many people own cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin, including Tether, stable coins? They all went away. Okay, there we go. All right, so about half the audience here are people who use other cryptocurrencies. Who are we talking about? This is a Bitcoin maximalist conference, and half these people are using other coins for other reasons. Do we accept this data, and can we move forward on this premise that this is our competition? Like, part of our competition is get the people to use Bitcoin, correct? And to not stop relying on these other systems? Do we accept that premise?
Sure, but it's a permissionless system, and that means that you have use and you have abuse. And you need to differentiate the two. And if you're naive and say it's all the same thing,
but what's the
then
bigger goal? Is the bigger goal to convince Peter Todd that like censorship is correct, or do you want to actually get people to use Bitcoin and to stop using alternative cryptocurrencies?
What? I'm not trying to convince anyone of censorship. That's ridiculous. And I've already explained why frivolous use of that term means you have nothing left when you have the US government come and put their boot on Foundry's neck and say you have to be OFAC compliant. You need a term for that.
I'm pretty sure the US government isn't going to give a damn what we just said on this stage when that happens. I think what they will care about is political lobbying about whether or not Foundry should be allowed to go do stuff. And that's just not relevant to the discussion at all. All of this is just noise. I mean, this whole time slot would have been much better used talking about L2 systems. But, I agreed to go and present here because, well, you want to be on stage.
I guess we don't have a lot of time.
Spam that much. You actually spammed the entirety of the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, I mean, we are coming to the end of our time, so I guess I'll give each of you an opportunity to take a minute and give us your closing statement. I guess, Mechanic, you went first, so maybe Luke, do you want to take a minute and give us your closing argument? No?
Come back to him.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Do you want to
go? Yeah, I would just say, like, look, I'm bullish on people. There's a few names that I'd want to evoke, right? Like, I believe in Giacomo Zucco and Jimmy Song. I believe in Warren Tsugami and Charlie Lee and these different people. I think the natural flow of people coming into the space is they get interested in alternative cryptocurrencies, and some of them progress to trying to put some of these ideas on the Bitcoin network, and then some of them become Bitcoin maximalists. That might be the progression of how people get into the space. I think that is actually naturally what we've seen occur. And there are great people and great contributors to this space who started out doing other things on other chains. And so we talk a lot about the validity of these use cases, but the validity of the use cases doesn't matter. The thing is getting somebody's attention, getting their interest, and then the belief that Bitcoin will align our values and incentives such that we can have this discussion. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not somebody who's a technologist. Like some of the stuff that you guys are saying, it took me years to even understand. You have to accept that Bitcoin is going to align people to caring about that, or what's the other solution, right? I think you ultimately then don't believe in Bitcoin and Bitcoin's ability to align incentives, and that's a much larger problem and a much larger discussion.
Okay, thank you, Pete Rizzo. Mechanic, do you want to take a minute?
I love the argument that if you scam people, but the scam has something to do with Bitcoin, they will become Bitcoiners, and therefore it was all great.
No, I'm not making that distinction at all. I'm saying that any exposure to the industry is good.
Well, I mean, it's the argument Brian Armstrong made for like 6 years, and it was never a particularly compelling one. So I'm sorry, I just find that ridiculous. When I talk to, if I'm sitting next to a random guy on an airplane and I'm telling him about Bitcoin, like, there's no way to do it.
And those people are going out and they're buying altcoins and other things, and there's nothing
let Mechanic finish his. Yeah,
you can buy altcoins. I'm not out here to try and. I'm not the kind of Bitcoin maximalist that refuses to accept that we don't live on the Bitcoin standard yet. I have a mortgage, I have insurance, car insurance, everything. I use fiat every day. There are people that, like Guy Swan, who just live on a Bitcoin standard, totally respect it. I find that an unrealistic standard to set. But at the same time, I need the dollar. I have to use it to have a realistic life. I definitely don't need shitcoins, and I definitely don't need to undermine Bitcoin's entire ethos by filling the chain up with garbage and making nodes impossible to run. I find that I don't have no actual need for that. I'm just looking for a greater fool to scam and buy my NFT before the whole scam dies.
Okay, thank you, Mechanic. Yeah. Peter Todd, take a minute.
I mean, I'm not going to say I agreed with anything Pete Rizzo just said there, but it doesn't really matter because when you get down to it, Ocean's a pool with, I don't know, what, less than 5% hash power right now? I mean, anything Ocean does, it really doesn't matter because 95% of miners will do something else. And this whole discussion is just a giant waste of time because we just have not found effective ways to prevent these things from happening. And, at some point you just got to give up and say, look, let the fee market do its thing, and it's far more useful for people to go focus on getting the next generation of L2s out there so that what fee rates are don't matter. If people go, pollute our chain with other stuff, frankly, I don't care. There's going to be lots of transactions in Bitcoin that I might not necessarily agree with the purpose of, but so what? That's just the price of having an open, decentralized system that's permissionless. If they want to use it for one thing, well, they're going to use it for one thing. And, the reality is, it is so easy to bypass filtering, things like RGB being an example of this, that you just have to accept people are going to do what they want. Now, does that mean that we add new features to Bitcoin that invite new use cases involving consensus that do things maybe we don't want? Well, maybe we want to be cautious there. But the things you can build today that people have already shown, we're not making that go away. The only thing we can do is make fees go up to price them out.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Luke, do you have a
Yeah.
Luke, do you have a final statement?
I want to remind everyone that fiat is dying, the US dollar is being inflated like crazy, most other fiat currencies are the same. We need Bitcoin to not have a very dark future ahead of us, and just letting Bitcoin fail should not be seen as an option. We need to do everything we can to make sure Bitcoin is successful.
Okay, well, thank you. And gentlemen, thank you all. So I hope you enjoyed the debate. And that's all we have time for. So we're going to wrap it up here. Everyone, please put your hands together for our participants: Luke, Bitcoin Mechanic, Peter Todd, and Peter Rizzo.